In this lecture, we're going to be talking about two ways that we classify sounds, via manner or place of articulation. And in interest of keeping this short, I have mostly included only the diagrams from your slides. So you'll notice that this video differs from the set of slides you have, but those contain more detail that might help you out as you're trying to learn this topic. All right, remember that articulation is just talking about how sounds are produced. So we have to know where things are when we produce them. That would be the place. And then we have to know how they relate to each other. Like, how is that sound produced? Is it produced with the vocal tract totally being shut off? Or is there an open flow of air out? Like when we talked about the difference between consonants and vowels. We can get way more specific than what we talked about then, and that's what I'm about to get into. So generally there are two types of articulators. You have your tongue, which you use to produce most sounds, and that one's generally considered an active articulator. And sometimes you have what's called a passive articulator, which would be something like the roof of your mouth. All those places I made you learn for the quiz on articulatory system. All right, so we're going to talk about, first we're going to start with the manner of articulation and talk about how those two, the tongue and other passive things like the stuff just sitting around in your mouth, how they work together to produce sounds. And you'll find all of these manners on your IPA chart. If we look at the pulmonic consonant section, you'll find a bunch of them, the ones that we're going to talk about today here, circled in red, on that they're sort of each row is labeled with a different manner of articulation. And as we talked about, most sounds are produced over the center of the tongue, but some of them are lateral. So there are those two main dimensions, and so you'll notice everything, if it's not marked as lateral, it's sort of center, right over the center of the tongue or that midline, but there are these two lateral ones where they differ slightly. All right, so first, how we can make a sense of manner of articulation, in particular for consonants. We want to consider how close those articulators get. Do they completely close together? That would be what we call our stops or plosives. Are they almost completely touching, but not quite? Those are our fricatives. Are they, a little bit more open than the fricatives? Those we call our approximates or semivowels. And then if they are the most open, then we get to our vowel sounds, those sonorous or resonant sounds we talked about earlier. There's also a few other differences, whether we can prolong the sound or whether it's really short, that we'll get into. All right, so here's a visual to help you think about whether you can prolong a sound or not. But you can often just try these out on your own and figure out for yourself whether you can prolong a sound or not, just based on if you know which sound goes in which group. So a stop would be a sound like p, p, just that p part of the sound. And if you try and prolong that p, you're just going to get a longer amount of time where your lips are together. Imagine that this is your lips here, so you start to close them when you make the p sound. You hold them together. If you want to hold on to it, it's just going to sound like p. You're going to finally get that little puff of air at the end once you release those lips. So that's how stops work. We close something off entirely, whether it's with our lips or tongue, and we can prolong the amount of time that those articulators are together. Whereas fricatives, we can also hold on to them for a long time. Fricatives are sounds like the S or Z sounds we talk about a lot, S or Z, and as long as my breath holds out, I can sit there buzzing like a bee for a long time. And what happens is airflow, if you imagine let's say this is a representation of Z. This is the top of your mouth. You're making that sound up against the alveolar ridge, but we'll just go with top of the mouth. And you have your tongue that's going up towards the top of the mouth. And air is flowing out of the mouth, but when it gets to this area where the tongue is really close, but not quite completely shutting off the airflow, it gets all turbulent. You get this hissy sound that is not as easy to hear with the zzz, but you can really hear it with the s. It's almost like when you crack your window in your car and you only crack it open a little bit and you're driving really fast. You probably hear that air rushing type of sound really loudly then. If you open it completely, you get a lot of wind in your face, but you don't have that noisy sound of the air rushing in through the cracked window, right? So it's the same thing with our articulators. Now, approximates are sounds like and and those we can also hold on to quite a bit. And the tongue tends to be farther away from the passive articulator. You'll notice there's more space here between this top, which can represent anything depending on what sound it is, but sort of the top of the mouth here, and this is representing the tongue. And the air flows through fairly smoothly. Maybe it gets a little bit turbulent here, but not as much as a fricative. And we also have a group of sounds that we call semivowels. They're almost like a vowel, but they're not quite. They're really, really short, like ya and wa. And those are really not prolongable, because if you hold on to ya, you'll notice you're saying E all of a sudden. You can try it yourself. Try and hold on to the E. You'll find yourself saying a vowel all of a sudden. And finally, we have our vowels here, our resonants, where the tongue allows more airflow. It's flowing out smoothly because the tongue is not that close to the passive articulator, the top of the mouth. All right, so that's sort of a short intro to each of those manners of articulation, or the main ones we need to know for English. And we'll go into more detail about fricatives, because there's a few more details with those. Right? And some phonetics and humor that you might be able to appreciate later. Fricatives are prolongable, so they don't stop. Also a play on the class of stops or plosives as well. Right, if we look more closely at fricatives and how they produce that little turbulent airflow, it's specific to what type of sound we are making. Right, so you can have what's called a narrow channel, or sometimes it's called a grooved type channel, and that is the type that we use to make sounds like s and z. All right, and that would be this one right here, where if you imagine you were looking right at the surface of the tongue, when we produce those sounds, we make this little sort of divot in our tongue so that it produces that particular type of sound. All right, and we also have sounds like TH sounds, whether they're voiced or voiceless. This is the symbol for the voiceless one, which is hard for you to hear in the recording, or Z, which has a slightly different shape. I'm going to have to turn on my pen so I can draw for you all. All right, the other option is this little symbol here. It looks sort of like a weird D with a line through it. That is Z. And our tongue tends not to have that little divot. It tends to be wider. We have a wider space for the air to travel over the top of that tongue when we make it. And we also have another, it's not grooved quite like S or Z, but another channel that is also considered narrow, but it's still that like slit-like shape, sort of like th and z, the voice the and all right, and so this one is considered narrow but not grooved. All right, but it's a narrow slit channel, while this one over here is a wide slit channel. All right, easily confused because they share some terms with other ones. And sounds that fall in this category are ones like this symbol. This is sh, like the shush sound, and zh, which is a symbol that we write like this. But we often represent that type of sound as in like a ZH if we're trying to write that out. So all those different channel shapes produce those different sounds. So it's not enough to know that just that the tongue is close to the top of the mouth and the air is turbulent. We can get even more precise about how the tongue should be shaped, because sometimes that does cause difficulties in people who don't have that type of control over their tongue. And also, I didn't think I kept that slide in there, we should talk about sibilants briefly, although we will talk about them more in speech science. There we go. All right, so when you're talking about fricatives, there are two different groups that people sometimes place them into, whether they have sort of a high pitch range or a low pitch range. So sounds that are sibilants are considered to have a high pitch, like they're higher than low, right? They're sort of, the sound they make is a little bit different. And sibilants include s, z, sh, and zh. And those lower ones that are called non-sibilants are f, as in the F sound, v, as in voiceless TH, and v, as in voice TH. All right, some people also group sound into this so-called strident or non-strident group. You can consult your notes for more details on that, but that's really not something that is based in phonetics or exactly how they are produced. So that's not something we focus on as much in this class. All right, now before we go on to lateral and medial articulations, let's go back to our chart here. I'm just going to use this as a point of reference for a few more sounds. Now we've talked about approximates. You'll find them in this row. All right, so there are approximates like that R sound in English, and you'll also find one of them in the row below, a lateral approximate. All right, these are sounds that really don't have too much fricative or turbulent airflow to them, too much frication, I should say. And they are starting to sound more like vowel sounds. And within that are sounds that we group in the semi-vowel category, although you'll also see them here classified with approximates and somewhere else on the chart. Actually, let me move on to my bigger chart here. There we go. All right, so you'll notice one sound here, this J, which, be careful, that might look like J to you, but in IPA this represents ya. And it's an approximate, but we also call it a semi-vowel because it's in that group that we talked about before that can't be prolonged. The other one you'll find down here, because we'll talk about it in more detail later, it doesn't fit nicely into that chart because it is both labial and velar. But it's also an approximate and something that can't be prolonged, so also a semi-vowel, and like you might guess, that is W. All right, and finally, in terms of manner or how things are produced, we have that resonant category that pretty much means vowels. That is something that we will be talking about pretty soon. We'll get into more detail about vowels. Oh, there I want to get back to my slide. All right, so we've already talked a bit about things going centrally over the tongue or over the sides. And this visual may help those who are more visual learners to see what the difference is. If you imagine that, let's say this striped area here is your tongue. If you're making a stop, a sound like t or duh, at a certain point your tongue is in the way. Nothing's getting out from the airflow coming out of your lungs. All right, but with other types of sounds, like a s, it's shaped like this. There's a little gap there where air can travel out. With approximates, that gap starts getting wider. And resonant or vowel sounds, then you've got a lot of room over the center of the tongue for air to escape through. But it's also possible to produce sounds with that tongue sort of in the way, in the middle. Although for most of our consonants, this isn't the case. You can have a lateral fricative with air escaping on each side or just one side. That would be that sort of lispy sound. You can also have an approximate like L, where we do have our tongue like this with the air on each side. Oh, our tongue tends to be right up there in the middle, blocking the airflow down the center. And some resonants, it is possible to produce them laterally, although we do not do that in English typically. All right, so we also have a few other sounds that you'll notice on the chart here. I switch back here. And you'll notice so far we've talked about plosives. Nasal sounds are produced through the nose. We'll talk about them in more detail later, but those and here and are pretty self-explanatory. We've talked about fricatives and laterals and approximates, so that just leaves the trills and taps or flaps. Now, trills are something that can be prolonged if you're talented. One of them that you may be able to produce, might be a little rusty, but is a bilabial trill. That's that type of motorboat sound. Or in Spanish, we have an alveolar trill for an R-type sound. Or this is the one that I'm better at because German uses this sound. You can have your tongue trill in the back of the mouth in the uvular area. This is all right, but if it's further forward, not as good as that. We call that an alveolar trill. All right, and you can keep that going as long as you can keep that trill action going. And we also have a sound that is just momentary, and this is one in English that we'll talk a little bit more, called a tap. Usually some people call it a flap. All right, we'll focus on that one. Oh, there we go. And so those trills, like, you can keep them going for quite a while, but this flap is only really brief, so brief that you probably don't realize you produce a sound like this. This would be the sound that we do rather than saying like a T sound, a classic T in the word butter. I mean, we don't really quite say it. We usually don't enunciate that carefully when we're saying words like butter or better. We usually say something like butter, better, where the tongue just quickly makes a little touch here and then lets go. It's not like the one where we can prolong and hold on to it like better. It's really short, better, where that tongue just reaches up and taps an area on the top of the mouth. Right? And that would be your tap sound in English. And if you're a Star Wars fan, that's for you. Watch out for those taps. They'll trick you when you get to transcribing sounds, because I'll expect you eventually to be able to transcribe those accurately. You can predict where they do occur in English, so it's not too scary. All right, moving on quickly. This is a bit easier than manner, because all you're doing here with place of articulation is just tying together all those things you just did in your quiz on the articulatory system, which is something that didn't seem to give people a lot of trouble, and this tends not to. All right, so normally when we talk about place of articulation, we're only naming the passive articulator. Something along here in the oral cavity. This is why I kind of just generalize and say the roof of the mouth. We also have an active articulator, our tongue, that's moving all around our mouth the whole time. But mostly we name somewhere along this area. For the most part, there's a few other areas that aren't seen here, like epiglottal, but we don't have an epiglottal sound in English, so we're mostly going to focus on these areas. But if you were to focus on the active articulator or the tongue, you can even get a little bit more explicit than what we talked about. You'll see here's still our tongue tip or the apex for apical sounds. We have the blade or front of the tongue for laminar sounds. We have the dorsum or body of the tongue for dorsal sounds, but we can even get more specific there, where we say sounds are either anterior dorsum, or if they're further back, posterior dorsum. And the root of the tongue isn't really involved in sounds, because you can't really manipulate it to touch parts there in that roof of the mouth. But sometimes that will also be called by its Latin, I believe, name, radix. And there's our epiglottis again. All right, so if, let's say we're trying to connect something here, we're going to say a sound where you are connecting the tip of your tongue, the apex, with an alveolar area. Yeah. All right, so in that case, you would be saying that you are moving your tip of the tongue up to touch this fleshy area behind your front teeth. Or we would say it's apical alveolar. All right, and now you can see why little kitty there is doing it wrong. That little tongue tip should be up touching the area behind the front teeth. All right, so if we want to be really specific about sounds, we can say, oh no, that should be an apical alveolar. And if you are well versed in phonetics, you should know exactly what that means. All right, but otherwise we're going to go through each one, and it's fairly straightforward. Or you can follow along with this diagram if that helps you. All right, so if we're saying something is produced with both lips, we call that, just here, all these columns here at the top of the IPA are connected to place of articulation. We call it bilabial. It's as simple as putting both lips together. And I believe I even have a picture there. So, all right, two lips together is a bilabial sound, or two lips close together, let's say in terms of other things besides stops. Or if you have an alveolar place of articulation, just imagine that tongue, it could be your tip or the blade of your tongue, touching the area behind your front teeth. Now, between that, you'll notice there's two other categories. So we jump from bilabial to alveolar, because in English, those are typical places for us to think of. But sometimes the others might apply. So labiodental means that you have your lower lip up against your front teeth, as in when you make a V sound. Or we can make dental sounds. Sometimes we might do that instead of hitting that alveolar area if we hit the back of the front teeth, or do something with our teeth and our tongue. All right, moving further back in the mouth, we have that area, sort of this area where it's not quite right up against the back of the teeth of the alveolar ridge, but a little further back. But we're still in that alveolar region, but just further back, and that has this word post added on top of it. So when you see post, think just a little bit further back, and that's where sh and j are produced. And usually we use our tongue tip or blade for that, or we might have our tongue tip bent upwards a little bit. However, if we curl that tongue back even more, this is where we get to this other so-called place. It's almost more like a manner of articulation, but it's called retroflex. That's when your tongue is nicely curled like this kitty is showing here. All right, and those are sounds that we don't have in English so much unless you might be somebody of Indian heritage, so you speak an Indian language like Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, and you have an accent in English, or English is spoken on the Indian subcontinent, where oftentimes retroflex versions of consonants are used. So rather than ta or da, you're saying ta, da, right? Something like that. And also moving back further in the mouth, we have palatal or velar consonants or sounds, right? And as you would imagine, pretty straightforward. For palatal sounds, the tongue is hitting the palate, that hard part of the roof of the mouth. Usually it's more the body of the tongue that's involved with that type of production, or the velar area, the soft palate, also with the body of the tongue. Now it's also possible to go back even further and have the tongue hit that uvular area, like that uvular trill I did for you. So when you are talking about a uvular sound, the tongue is hitting down that little part that sort of dangles in the back of our mouth off of the velum. All right, now putting all this together, actually, before we talk about putting all this together, I'll just mention other areas and go back to this picture, use this. There are some places that are not in normal English, but in disordered speech sounds, you have all sorts of possibilities. You might run into these. So there is also the pharyngeal place of articulation, where the root of the tongue, one of the few areas it gets involved, this area is drawn into the pharynx. So this whole back is pulled back a little bit, and that type of sound is only found in somebody mispronouncing a sound, or often Arabic languages might have that sound. Similarly, you can also draw this epiglottis back and make sounds using that. That would be called an epiglottal place of articulation. And I should not leave off this one, because there's glottal sounds in English, where there's air driven through the glottis. We have the H sound, where the airflow is kind of turbulent, and there's an open glottis for that sound. But we also have a sound called a glottal stop, where our vocal folds are briefly, this area is briefly shut off, and that is the type of sound like in the middle of uh-oh. So right in the middle where I go that's a glottal stop, and then I open my vocal folds up again and say oh. All right, so that's a lot of information to take in, and we'll spend a lot of time practicing it, but two last notes. What you will be doing for most of the semester is putting together what we've just talked about, place and manner, as well as what the vocal folds are doing. Are they vibrating? So that's called voiced, or are they not vibrating, voiceless? And we can look at the IPA chart and put all this information together. We can say something is applosive and something is bilabial, add that together with what the voice is doing, you have the articulatory description for that sound. So when we label sounds, we usually use all of these three terms: voice, place, and manner. And when you say something is a voice bilabial nasal, you understand it to be or this symbol. Right? So something we are working our way up towards. And finally, there's a few other groups, other ways we can classify sounds, and we'll be working on this also as we get into more detail about each sound. We have things that are called obstruents, and plosives and fricatives fall in that category. Everything else is called a sonorant. All right, and we will get more into those categories with the more detailed coverage of each sound, but let me know what questions you have on this topic as you do the warm-up and anything that I didn't cover enough on this lecture or you have questions on after doing your reading.